news is, despite the fact that I forgot to have you recite the first verse of the introit, forgot to take the stand back to the table when I was supposed to, tripped over my robe when I was trying to stand up, and the mouse is giving me fits, Jesus still rose from the tomb. That was a meme I saw on Facebook earlier this week, and I kind of chuckled until I just lived it out. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. As I was planning the service for this morning, I was reminded of something I told several people over the course of 12 months or so back in 1989 and 1990. Yeah, I can remember what I said to people back then, but I'm still a little shaky on what I had for breakfast this morning. I was considering all the extra elements we were going to add to this service, and then on top of that, it's a communion Sunday, and there's a brunch after the service, when I remembered those words. You see, that was the year I was served as first vice president of the Origsburg Lions Club. And one of the responsibilities of the first vice president was to line up speakers for the meetings from October through April. And all I needed was about a dozen or so folks to speak at meetings. So I started making my phone calls and talking to people. The head of the Domestic Violence Agency, a drug and alcohol program director, and several others who I don't recall anymore. Now, like the Pocono Lions, our club met for dinner. And as dinner was winding down, the president would begin the business meeting. We would go through whatever business we had, and the last agenda item was the speaker. Now, we met in the social hall of a local firehouse, and that firehouse had a bar, and a 6-ounce glass of beer was $0.25. So over a few weeks and phone calls back and forth, I was able to line up most of my speakers. They would ask the logistical questions, and I would make sure they knew how to find the firehouse, because it was a little bit of an adventure to find this place. And they made sure they knew what time the meeting was and what time they should be there. And almost everyone asked me this question: how long do you want me to speak? And my answer was always the same: take as much time as you need, but remember one thing: the only thing between the guys and the bar is you. So it's up to you. I remembered those words because as I was preparing for today, I realized the only thing between all of you and the brunch is me. So Ron just read Mark's account of the resurrection. Now I wonder if some of you are wondering why Ron didn't keep going to the end of the story. The story goes on, right? That's not the end of the story. Why did Ron stop the reading there? Now, Ron's answer is because that's where Pastor Mike told me to stop. But see, here's the thing. In Mark's gospel, as it was originally written, that's the end of the story. It stops right there. In Mark's gospel, there's no appearance to Mary in the garden. There's no appearance to the two on the road to Emmaus. There's no appearance in the upper room. There's no great commission, and there's no ascension. Mark stops with the women frozen in fear. Now, scholars tell us that sometime after the original text was written, someone decided that the ending was just not right. How could they leave the story hanging like that? Now, I don't watch TV that much, but I understand when The Sopranos ended, a whole lot of people are upset because they didn't wrap up all the loose ends. Well, that's kind of like this. How can you leave this story just hanging like this? We gotta come up with a conclusion to this thing. So somewhere along the way, folks added verses 9 through 20, which is what I just kind of summarized for you a couple seconds ago. But the lectionary folks said, you know what? If it was good enough for the original author, it's good enough for us also. So let's take a couple minutes to consider the original resurrection story as recorded in the first gospel, the gospel attributed to Mark. Mark tells us that early in the morning, 3 women, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, head out to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body. Now, interestingly, in chapter 15, Mark also tells us that these same three women were present to witness the crucifixion. So here we are 2,000 or so years later. These same stories are read every year. And I wonder if we missed something. Notice it is the women who stayed with Jesus until the end. Notice it was the women who set out early in the morning to anoint Jesus' body. The movement had been crushed, the shepherds struck, and the sheep scattered. Yet the women hung in there. The women hung in there. And early Sunday morning went off to the tomb and found the stone rolled away and the tomb empty. You know, it's a funny thing about God. Pastor Tony Robinson reminds us that God has a preferential option for the unlikely. God gets a kick out of messing around with our expectations. God seems to like choosing people that conventional wisdom would not consider in a million years. Like David, the youngest son who was left attending the sheep. Like Moses, who had a public speaking problem. Like Jeremiah, who was a raw youth. Like Mary, who was unwed and poor. And like Paul, who was known as the enemy of the church. And I think that preferential option for the unlikely continues today. But going back to our text, God is doing the same thing here. God is saying, you know what? Patriarchal society, I'm not buying it. I don't care if you will not allow women to testify in your court. I don't care if you think women should not have a voice. It will be women who witness the death of Jesus, and it will be women who discover the empty tomb, and it will be women who first preach the good news of resurrection. How many times have I read this story and not realized the courage those women displayed? Am I the only one? They did not hide. They claimed the freedom to still associate with Jesus, and they were rewarded by being the first witnesses to the resurrection. Pastor Bill Wiley Kellerman suggests that a more recent example of this kind of courage can be seen in the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, or the mothers of the disappeared, who marched in the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina after their children were disappeared during the state terrorism of the military dictatorship. The mothers, by marching, defied the terrorism meant to silence all opposition. It's interesting, though, how our other texts this morning reflect the context in which they are written. The patriarchal culture is very evident in both the Acts text and the 1 Corinthians text we heard. There's Peter sharing the story of Jesus with Cornelius and his guests, and he fails to mention the women who actually witnessed the crucifixion and discover the empty tomb. And if you listen to Paul wants you to believe the first one to see Jesus is Peter. We certainly know different. So the women arrive at the tomb and discover the stone is rolled away. They look in the tomb and they see a young man dressed in a white robe. The Greek word translated young man is neaniskos. The word appears only one other time in Mark's gospel, in chapter 14, when the young man flees when Jesus is arrested. Now, some scholars believe that the young man in that scene in the garden and the young man in the tomb were the same individual. Some further speculate that that young man is also the author of this gospel. The young man says, Jesus isn't here, but go tell his disciples and Peter to head to Galilee. Think about that for a minute. Go tell his disciples and Peter. I wonder how Peter was feeling right about now. How much guilt was he still carrying for denying Jesus? Then the women, assuming they eventually deliver the message, tell him that the young man made sure to mention his name. Jesus wanted to see him. And what a message that must have sent to Peter. And what a message that sends to us. So what do the women do? Mark tells us after hearing the instructions from the young man, they flee and don't say a word because they were afraid. And that is how the original version of this gospel ends. No tying up all the loose ends, just this question of, well, what did they do? Mark is telling us that despite the courage the women displayed up to this point, they responded to the news of resurrection in terror and fear. Wouldn't you? Think about it. Would any of us react differently? Now, in John's version of this story, Mary Magdalene is the only one to go to the tomb. But let's compare the two stories. In Mark tells us that Mary Magdalene and the other women were so afraid, they were terrified, they said nothing to anyone. John, on the other hand, says that Mary Magdalene ran off saying, I have seen the Lord. These two Gospels give us two very different reactions to the same event. Paralyzing fear and joy and glee. But they do something else as well. These two responses give us the range of human answer to resurrection. Say nothing, say everything. These two stories give us permission to fall anywhere within that range. It's up to you. Resurrection is personal. It's something each of us must consider at some point or many points in our life. It's up to you. It's you, not Mary Magdalene, that goes to the tomb. And when you get there, the stone is rolled away. Jesus is not there. And a messenger gives you a message delivered to the disciples and to all of us. How will you respond? Do you say nothing out of fear? Do you run joyfully with the good news? Or are you somewhere in between? Imagine you are the witness. How do you respond? Friends, it's up to you. Amen.